America doesn't really let you die. It warehouses you, it bills you, and then it ultimately gaslights you and your family into compliance. Because it's never really been about quality of care and human dignity as someone begins the process of dying. It's become more about how much wealth extraction can occur from all parties, whether that be the hospital itself that treats you, the doctor, the insurance company, Medicare, actuaries, LCSWs that are just looking to protect their own interests and the interests of their employers, family members that are looking to finally get over and get what's theirs once they see that opportunity of weakness. That's really what dying has become in America, big business. And as we continue to work through and understanding this narcissism nation, one of the things that we really have to come to terms with is the fact that all these elements that have been sold to us, power of attorney, wills, trusts, etc., pensions, Medicare, what have you, all of that has ultimately been just an exercise to ensure that more people make money off of your pain. Thank you for joining me today. My name is Enrique. This is Precision Cycle, Narcissism Nation. Last week I took off because I've been undergoing a lot of personal family issues. My father-in-law is going through the process of his final days here on earth, and he's lived a very long life, some of which has been really happy and had great moments with his children and grandchildren. Other moments have been really difficult because he's the product of someone who grew up in a time when there was a world war going on and migrated to this country and has seen different versions of the American dream. He's maintained a level of dignity to his life, one where he was very responsible with the way that he saved his money, worked hard, ensured that he had a proper pension that would take care of him and his wife in retirement. And just like Stanley Kubrick presented in 2001, A Space Odyssey, he's finally at that black monolith moment where he is now being called upon to evolve into that next version of himself. But one of the things that has become painfully apparent as I've sat here and I've seen the demise of him physically, mentally, cognitive ability, and an inability to really advocate for oneself, you start to see how the system itself becomes the mechanism that is the oppressive, abusive power here. That begins with the family itself, the family dynamics at play, the infighting that's occurring. One of the things we've come to realize is that in these times of family strife, when we have loved ones beginning to move on, as someone who's a Gen Xer with older parents myself, I'm going to start to have to navigate a lot of this. It is baked into the cake of our experience, especially if you're a first generation migrant to this country. You start to see all the familiar patterns come out in the family dynamics and how you used to fight. Back then, you labeled it as just sibling rivalries and squabbles, but ultimately those squabbles and people behind those personalities have evolved to illustrate their own levels of narcissistic personality disorders, borderline personality disorders, all personality disorders on top of whatever legitimate neurological issues they may have, autism and ADHD, all kinds of other types of obsessive compulsive disorders and paranoia-based disorders that people in this country have. All of that starts to become manifested, and you see that very plainly as you start to go through this process. The reality is that these times of strife will begin to create those mechanisms where the full expression for these disorders will really be front and center. And what you will start to see, and people will label family dynamics, is ultimately the Super Bowl event of everyone's entrenched traumatic experience, which has translated itself into a personality disorder. And that with a lot of behavioral splitting that will occur, people will start blaming other people because those narcissistic centers are being activated rightfully because of the fear being experienced. And oftentimes the fear of seeing a father or a mother going through the dying process will put someone in a position where they will have to manifest all types of narcissistic defenses in order to not engage a lot of those fears of emotion that are now significantly implicating those persons' behavioral sets. And as you continue to go through the process, you start to see that families begin to rupture, not so much because of the individual personalities that are now at odds, but because you see that the overall family structure was never strong to begin with. It was a very weak structure that began with the parents, who in themselves were never able to reconcile a lot of their own personal narcissistic issues. And that sets the groundwork for the siblings to now create this sense of ownership, which is not necessarily the thing that anyone needs at that moment. This is where we start to get into fights about trusts and wills and power of attorneys, when in reality, we've essentially, as migrants, have been given these tools and have adapted them in unnatural ways, which they were never really meant to be adapted in that ethnic lifestyle. And so one of the things that I want to go through is some of the things I've been seeing, because it is a family therapy case study. Everyone is fighting to regulate their own trauma through their dad's body. This is the thing you often see with a lot of different forms of these cases. The individual will utilize this space to bring up and process their own unresolved traumatic experience that is now fully being expressed, all because of this emotional quagmire that's being presented here. And the thing leads us to is understanding the power of attorneys and wills and these legal mechanisms, along with the medical aspect of it, illustrates the farce that these things are. Power of attorney becomes an abusive tool, right? Power of attorney isn't functioning as a fiduciary when you put it in the hands of your child. It's functioning as an enmeshment weapon. That's really the truth of it. Advanced directives are the paper shields that these organizations, hospitals, caseworkers hide behind to not only enable family dysfunction, but also absolve themselves of any real duty to cure and help a system which honors a person on the way out rather than a space of calm and peace. These two mechanisms are built to inherently create divisions, because now you've given power to somebody in the family unit that is differentiated by that power component. Rather than have a unified family system, you have someone elevated, lording over others, making decisions that may not be something that the actual person who's going through the dying process wants. About people being necessitated and despite their wishes, because other people hold power of attorney and are more interested in maintaining the person being alive for all types of other reasons, whether that be financial or just their own personal grief and unresolved traumatic experience that puts them into a position where they don't want to see this person die. That becomes a major issue. And we see how these tools, these legal mechanisms that were put into place to help families cope and navigate these spaces, are now another element of abuse cast upon the person dying. We see how hospice social workers straddle the line between ethics and liability to the point where they defer to the power of attorney, which ultimately be run by somebody who has very opposing views to anything that is comfort-based. And that's something that was very evident in a lot of families, my family being one of them. It speaks to encoded language, and it ensures that people are able to say things in certain ways that allow them to have just enough plausible deniability so as they're not going to be implicated when the time comes when someone's here to question them. The medical legal system is designed for stable families, and that's why these power of attorneys and wills and trusts were created. In families that have significant trauma, it becomes an instrument of extreme narcissistic control. This is very evident and is something that these families, unfortunately, do not have very good idea of what exactly they're getting into, because they've never really understood what the power of attorney documents and terms really mean. We have the first generation, the migrant story, come in and try to adopt rules that ultimately were never created for them. We have to rethink these if we're going to be successful in managing a lot of the family trauma that will be ongoing due to the dying process as our elders begin to die off. And we see this with how some people are looking to override the orders of doctors. Some people think that they have better understanding of what medicine is and look to augment some type of comfort care regime with their own understanding of what medicine may be. This is because we have families where people become doctors, lawyers, therapists and they think they can provide these services to their family. One of the things that you start seeing with first generation individuals who are doctors and lawyers is that they will provide services to their family. And when these situations arise where you have conflict of interests, they don't see the danger here, because what ends up happening is you see someone, for instance, who's a doctor that may be overriding some other doctor's care regime with their own understanding of how pharmacology works, which leads to needless suffering and more family strife and division. We have always said you don't treat your family, you don't provide services for your family as a mental health professional. You're not here to diagnose and work through your own family's pain. But we end up doing that because our parents and family members will ask us to fill those roles, and they attack those narcissistic centers where we feel we are experts on certain things. When the time comes to put our trust into a system designed to allow them to transition in the most comfortable way, we don't necessarily adhere to that and try to implement our own expertise. That's our own narcissism, our own inability to control our egos to the detriment of the person who is going through this experience. As a child, you're not the one that's going to feel the brunt of not getting the proper medication because you don't agree. These are pitfalls of why it is difficult for migrant families, for first generation families rooted in trauma, to have professional level individuals having that professional level way of thinking adapted to the family unit, rather than hiring professionals and ceding that control to organizations and entities designed to do that. And so we see how the dying process leads us to the economics of death, right? Everyone wants to have their hand in the cookie jar. Everyone wants to make sure that they're good on paper, that they're on the will, they're named the beneficiary. But again, how many families utilize these products the way they're supposed to be utilized, right? The term and whole life insurance industry has essentially gotten rich. And we all have that family member, that cousin, that uncle who works over at that insurance company trying to sell you some type of a policy at that dinner party or that barbecue. And how many of us take out those policies thinking they're meant for one thing and then realize they weren't, or we cash them out? You end up with a lot of ancillary motivations here, which aren't necessarily rooted in love. How many decisions are being made by power of attorneys that are children based on continued money income or the distribution of wealth that they are interested in? When you have properties that were bought back in the 60s and 70s for pennies on the dollars and are now being sold for millions of dollars, there's a lot of incentive there to not necessarily provide the best quality of care for someone and make those fiduciary responsibilities hold true. This is how families become vultures when they take their narcissism and amp it up to that next level, not out of pure malice, but because the American system weaponizes the financial dependency that a lot of families have. And when we start to see that the spigot runs out, that's when we start to see people come out of the woodwork and start staking their claims. Ultimately, again, leads to more family trauma and infighting and division that ultimately breaks these families apart. There's a reason why when your grandmother dies, you don't talk to your cousins anymore. It's because those old world mentalities have essentially died with that person. And now we're truly that first generational American mentality of you're on your own. We're, as a family, as an individual, you are a person here that's only here to look out for yourself. This is unfortunately the economics of death that drives that. But we also have to see that the illness our elders are going through and dying of are the psychological and somatic receipts for bad psychology and a bad way of living. People that die with the physical manifestations of Parkinson's, for instance, and years of pain and debilitation, what that really is the receipt for decades of cowardice, avoidance, and enmeshment. What that has really taught me through all this. If we can take anything from these observations that we're doing as Gen Xers watching our parents die, let it be a cautionary tale for our grandkids who are now being modeled boundaries that truly create dignity and are not rooted in the enmeshments of our families that are continuing to create generational traumatic experiences for themselves as they continue to navigate emotions tied to unresolved traumatic experiences within the family. And we see how religion here is a mask. We hide behind the religion and we're preaching faith, but we end up practicing gaslighting because we're just looking at greed and denial. We see people die in their own way, and they're left to have to suffer the sins of their own inadequacies. So we see how death has become its own industrial complex. This in and of itself is just another one of those grift operations where it's about last and most profitable grift that exists. We have all the way from burial plots and caskets to the skilled nursing facility, hospice, and all the other types of interventions that are provided to us. And we start to think that these are things that are great, part of the system that makes the United States great. On the contrary, these are the things that makes this country not necessarily the best one out there for this experience, because what ends up happening is we monetize people's pain. We sell that back to doctors and organizations that sell us interventions, sell us martyrdom, but ultimately the system keeps stripping away these things that make us human. By the end of it, when the person ends up dying and we're putting him in the ground, we've lost so much of what we were actually losing, which was this actual person, this ray of light, this family unit that at one time was a stable presence in our families. And instead, we've resorted to and devolved that into who's right and who's wrong and who gets what and who doesn't. That's really the sickening part of the dying process in the American system, the devaluation and dehumanization that occurs from people who should be honored as opposed to being seen as something to warehouse or apply an intervention to, or someone who shouldn't be allowed to have a say in their care because they've given that over to some other person wrongfully. And if there's anything to be learned from these cautionary tales, it's that real freedom is planning your exit on your terms with boundaries, clarity, courage, dignity. That's the thing that will give your kids the freedom to break away from this generational cycle of pain that we want to continue to hold on to. We could sit here and talk about how we go and we do therapy and we get over some of the things that we hold on to. The reality that we're not necessarily changing anything when we adhere to these enmeshed systems that continue to gaslight us into thinking that we're loving the person that's actively dying by making decisions they don't even agree with. If you're someone going through that situation and you are seriously sitting there thinking that your ego is more important than the person suffering, then that's on you to understand that you have some kind of personality disorder that should be checked out. So this was more of a personal diatribe today. I'm back this week. Good news is that I've transitioning this Narcissism Nation a little bit because I will be starting law school in the fall. I'm hoping to bring legal aspects and policy, national policy and politics with that psychological perspective. But again, if you'd like to join Precision Cycle and become a Precision Cycle operator, someone that sees through the lies of the systems and is able to get themselves recalibrated in a way that allows them to align themselves with their own desires and goals, please feel free to reach out. Enrique at elevateepo.com, Precision Cycle TV on TikTok, Instagram, and Threads, Narcissism Nation on YouTube. Thank you very much for joining me today. I will be back on Wednesday for another Narcissism Nation. Until then, thank you very much.